They found 47 skulls grinning from the church steeple. That was what greeted the residents of Redemption Creek, Arizona, on the morning of August 9, 1891. 47 human skulls strung together with barbed wire like some unholy rosary, hanging from the bell tower and swaying in the desert wind. Each skull had been meticulously cleaned, bleached white by chemicals and sun, with a single word carved into the forehead. The words spelled out a message when read in order. The bone collectors claim this town for the desert god. Nobody knew who had hung them there. Nobody had heard anything during the night. But everyone in Redemption Creek understood immediately what it meant. The legend they had dismissed as campfire tales and drunken ravings had come to their doorstep. The bone collectors were real, and they had marked the town for harvest. The gang that would become known as the Bone Collectors began with a single man named Josiah Crane in the winter of 1887. Josiah had been a medical student in Philadelphia before everything went wrong. He had been fascinated by phrenology, the pseudoscience that claimed personality and intelligence could be determined by the shape and size of the skull. His professors had dismissed his obsession as eccentric but harmless, right up until they discovered what he was doing in the dissection laboratory after hours. Josiah had been taking skulls from the cadavers, more skulls than his studies required, hiding them in his boarding house room and arranging them in strange patterns. When confronted, he tried to explain that he was mapping the geography of human evil, that certain skull formations indicated criminal tendencies, that he was building a collection that would revolutionize the understanding of morality and sin. The university expelled him immediately and suggested he seek psychiatric care. Instead, Josiah Crane headed west, carrying 3 stolen skulls in his traveling bag. He ended up in the New Mexico territory, working as a surveyor's assistant, still obsessed with his theories about bones and evil. But the West changed something in Josiah, or perhaps it revealed something that had always been there. He began to believe that the desert itself was alive, that it was a god of sorts, ancient and hungry, that demanded offerings of bone and suffering. He started with dead prospectors he found in the desert, men who had died of thirst or snakebite or accident. He would take their skulls, clean them carefully, and arrange them in circles at his campsites, claiming he was creating protective wards. His surveying crew thought he was mad but harmless, right up until the night in February 1888, when 3 of them disappeared, and Josiah was found the next morning covered in blood, surrounded by freshly harvested skulls. Josiah fled before the law could catch him, but he was not alone anymore. During his flight, he encountered 4 other men who would form the core of the Bone Collectors, each one as damaged and strange as Josiah himself. The first was Amos Blackwood, a former gravedigger from Texas who had developed a hatred for the living so profound that he would dig up fresh graves just to sit among the corpses. Amos believed that death was the only honest state of being, that the living were all lying to themselves, and that bones were the truest form of human existence because they could not deceive. The second was a Navajo man named Hastin Nez, though he had abandoned his given name and now called himself Only Bones. Hastin had been a medicine man until a fever killed his entire family in a single week. The tragedy broke something fundamental in him, and he became convinced that the spirits of the dead could only be controlled through the possession of their bones, that whoever held the most skulls held the most power over the spirit world. The third was Luther Grimm, a German immigrant who had worked as a butcher in Kansas City until he was arrested for preserving human remains in his meat locker. He claimed he was studying anatomy, but the bodies he had been collecting were all missing their heads. Luther escaped from jail during a fire and fled west, bringing with him an encyclopedic knowledge of how to reduce a human body to its skeletal components. The fourth was a woman named Patience Whitmore, perhaps the most disturbing member of the group. Patience had been raised in a strict religious community that practiced regular corporal punishment. She had murdered her father with a hammer when she was 17, carefully removed his skull, and kept it hidden under her bed for 3 years before anyone discovered it. When asked why, she said his skull told her secrets that his living mouth never would have shared. She had escaped an asylum in Colorado and had been wandering the territories, collecting animal skulls and talking to them like companions. These 5 came together in the spring of 1888, drawn by some dark magnetism, and Josiah Crane became their prophet. He told them about the desert god, about how bones were sacred offerings, about how entire towns could be consecrated through proper ritual. The others listened and believed because they wanted to believe, because it gave meaning to their madness. Their first target was a small ranching settlement called Esperanza in southern New Mexico. Population 32. The bone collectors spent 2 weeks watching the settlement, learning routines, counting heads. Then, on a moonless night in June 1888, they struck. They moved through Esperanza like a plague, entering homes silently, using chloroform-soaked rags to render families unconscious. Josiah had insisted there be no shooting, no unnecessary noise. This was to be a harvest, not a battle. By dawn, every resident of Esperanza was dead, their throats cut with surgical precision by Luther Grimm's butcher knives. What happened next would define the bone collectors' terrible legend. They spent 3 days in Esperanza processing the bodies. Luther directed the work, teaching the others how to separate heads from bodies, how to remove flesh and brain matter, how to boil skulls in lye until they were clean and white. Josiah supervised the ritual arrangement, placing skulls in specific patterns he claimed the desert god had revealed to him in dreams. When they finally left Esperanza, the town looked like a bone garden. Skulls lined the main street on posts. Skulls were stacked in pyramids in the town square. Skulls hung from doorways and windows. Skulls were arranged in circles around a central cairn where Josiah had placed a message written in blood. The desert god has been fed. This place is now holy. It took 3 days before a passing freight wagon discovered what had happened. The driver rode straight to the nearest military fort, without stopping, babbling about demons and death. The cavalry patrol that investigated Esperanza found the skull displays, but no bodies. The bone collectors had disposed of the corpses by burning them in a mass pyre outside town, leaving nothing but ashes. The territorial authorities tried to keep the incident quiet, but word spread anyway. Newspapers picked up the story, each retelling more lurid than the last. The bone collectors became a subject of horrified fascination across the West. Some claimed they were a cannibal cult. Others said they were devil worshippers. A few suggested they were doing the work of some ancient evil that had awakened in the desert. The truth was somehow worse than any of the rumors. The bone collectors believed they were performing a sacred duty, cleansing the land by returning it to the bones beneath the soil, making offerings to their desert deity. And they were just getting started. Over the next 3 years, the bone collectors struck 7 more settlements. Never the same method twice. Sometimes they would kill everyone, harvesting 30 or 40 skulls at once. Other times they would take only specific victims, the town leaders, the wealthiest families, anyone who seemed to embody the pride and prosperity that Josiah claimed the desert god hated. But they always left the skulls on display. That was the signature, the calling card that spread terror across the territories. Skull gardens, skull totems, skull messages, each arrangement more elaborate and disturbing than the last. In the town of Bitter Springs, They arranged 63 skulls in a perfect spiral leading to the well, each skull facing inward as if staring at something at the spiral's center. In the settlement of Last Hope, they hung skulls from every tree in the small orchard, creating a forest of the dead that swayed and rattled in the wind. In the mining camp of Silver Vein, they placed skulls in the mine shaft at precise intervals going down 300 feet, creating a descending gallery of death. The bone collectors also began marking their victims before death. Amos Blackwood had started the practice, using a heated brand to mark foreheads with a symbol that looked like a simplified skull. Josiah claimed this marked the victim as belonging to the desert god, that it sanctified the harvest. The branded skulls were always given places of honor in their displays, positioned at cardinal points or atop central structures. Possesses were formed, of course. The army sent patrols. The Pinkertons got involved, but the bone collectors were ghosts, appearing and disappearing across the vast emptiness of the territories. They never stayed in one place, never left witnesses who could identify them, never followed a predictable pattern. What finally led to their downfall was not superior detective work, but simple human error and paranoia. By 1891, the 5 members of the bone collectors had accumulated over 200 skulls. They kept them in a hidden canyon in the Arizona desert, arranged in Josiah's elaborate patterns, creating what he called the Cathedral of Bones. The gang would return to this place between raids, and Josiah would preach to the others about the desert god's pleasure, about how their work was bringing about some great transformation. But Patience Whitmore was starting to hear different voices from the skulls. They were telling her that Josiah was lying, that there was no desert god, that this was all madness without meaning. She shared these doubts with Amos Blackwood during a moment of weakness. Amos told Josiah. Josiah decided that Patience had been corrupted, that she needed to join the collection to be purified. On the night of July 23, 1891, the 4 men held Patience down while Josiah branded her forehead. Then Luther Grimm cut her throat. They processed her skull and added it to the Cathedral of Bones, placing it at the very center of Josiah's largest circular pattern. But Patience's death changed the dynamic of the group. Hasty Nez became convinced that her spirit was now angry, that adding her skull to the collection had brought a curse upon them. He began performing his own rituals, trying to appease what he perceived as Patience's vengeful ghost. The paranoia spread. Amos started believing that Luther was planning to betray them. Luther became convinced that Josiah was secretly insane and leading them to destruction. Hastian withdrew into his own world, spending hours talking to skulls and getting no response. When they arrived at Redemption Creek in August 1891 and hung those 47 skulls from the church steeple, it was their most public statement yet. But it was also their last. The residents of Redemption Creek, instead of fleeing, barricaded themselves in their homes and sent for help. The territorial governor dispatched 2 cavalry units and a Pinkerton team. The bone collectors retreated to their Cathedral of Bones, prepared to make a final stand. But the paranoia that had been building finally erupted. On the night of August 15th, before the cavalry even arrived, Amos shot Luther in the back, convinced he was about to betray their location. Hastian attacked Amos in retaliation, cutting his throat. Josiah, seeing his vision collapsing, shot Hastian and then turned his gun on himself. When the cavalry found the Cathedral of Bones 3 days later, all 4 men were dead, surrounded by over 200 skulls arranged in intricate, meaningless patterns. The soldiers spent 2 days carefully collecting every skull, trying to identify victims, trying to bring some dignity back to the dead. Most of the skulls were eventually identified and returned to families or given proper burial, but 17 skulls were never identified, their origins unknown. their stories lost. These were buried together in a mass grave outside Santa Fe, marked with a simple stone that read, "Unknown victims of the bone collectors, may they rest." Redemption Creek survived the ordeal, though it never fully recovered. The church steeple where those 47 skulls had hung was torn down and rebuilt, but people said you could still hear rattling sounds on windy nights, as if phantom bones were swaying in the breeze. Several families moved away, unable to live with the memory of what had happened. The Cathedral of Bones was dynamited by the army, collapsing the canyon and burying Josiah Crane's mad vision under tons of rock. But prospectors and wanderers still claim to find human skulls in that region, bleached white by the sun, half buried in the sand, staring up at the sky with empty sockets. Josiah Crane's journal was recovered from the cathedral and is now kept in a private collection in Washington. The entries become increasingly incoherent toward the end, filled with drawings of skull patterns and rambling descriptions of conversations with the desert god. The final entry, dated August 14, 1891, reads simply, "The bones have spoken. They say we are next. The harvest is complete. We become the offering." The legend of the bone collectors lived on long after their deaths, warped and exaggerated in the retelling. Some claimed they had collected thousands of skulls. Others said they were never really killed, that they still wander the desert collecting bones. A few insisted the desert god was real and still waits for new followers to make offerings. But the truth was simpler and sadder. 5 broken people found each other and built a religion around their madness, convinced themselves that horror had meaning, that death could be sacred if arranged properly. They killed over 200 people in 3 years, not for money or revenge or even pleasure, but because they believed bones were prayers and skulls were scripture. And sometimes in the desert night, when the wind blows across the empty places, people swear they can hear rattling sounds, like wind chimes made of bone, like laughter made of death, like the echo of Josiah Crane's voice still preaching to an audience of skulls that no longer listen.